My name is Lita. I'm the Creative Director at Deeproot. Today, Jim Urban will be speaking on 3 design issues that impact long-term health of urban trees: tree spacing, sizing the tree opening, and water harvesting into soil below paving. This webinar will discuss the biological and arboricultural basis for understanding these tree requirements and look at typical design decisions and how they affect trees and long-term project performance. The goal is to share examples of critical lessons as well as ways of achieving solutions that meet the needs of both the design team and the trees, and to discuss where changes in design approach are needed to create truly sustainable landscapes. We will be recording the webinar, and a link to it will be included in a follow-up email that should go out to everybody tomorrow. Attendees are muted throughout the presentation, which will be about 45 minutes, and there will be time at the end for questions. Please submit any questions at any time during the presentation using the chat box in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. At the end of the webinar, I will speak all of those aloud so that everybody can hear Jim's responses. So with that, we're going to begin.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Let me put this on full screen. So much of what I've talked about in the past is pretty much underground, things that affect the tree roots, and how the tree grows. But there are a couple of things that have dramatic change or impact on what we actually see on the surface. And these can also impact how well the tree grows. And I thought it would be good to have a discussion about these 3 items. So the first one that, Lita, it's, am I on full screen?
You are.
Yes?
Yep. We can see. Yep. We can see the full screen.
And can you see it flashing back and forth?
Nope. All we see is the black slide with the up by roots cover.
Yeah. Okay. I'm having trouble getting it to go to another slide.
Okay. It is not advancing on our side either.
All right. How about that? Is it now looking at a different slide?
No, now we're looking just at the, we're looking at 4 slides in the slide viewer on your screen.
All right, so let me try this again. Now you should be able to see the whole image.
We do, and it looks like a walkway boulevard with trees and tables and chairs.
Okay, so essentially the thesis of today's talk is that a lot of the things that we did as designers in the past worked okay because the trees never really grew very well. And when they did grow well, they caused problems. This is the Charlottesville Mall in Virginia, near University of Virginia, where there's a School of Landscape Architecture. And for some magical reason, most having to do with the age of the buildings on the street and the kind of soil, these trees grew really well. And it's been a constant problem for the city to maintain these very tight brickwork right up against the tree, as these trees have grown very well. Also some pruning issues, but it is a tightly spaced little bosques of trees. So the 3 things that we're going to talk about are this area right around the trunk flare. We're going to talk about the spacing of trees and how that impacts their health. And then finally, how do we get water into the soil under the pavement, which we're increasingly realizing is a very important part of the tree success equation. So let's start with canopy growth and spacing. We know that trees, as we get them closer together, change the shape at which they grow, and also the length of time that they will actually live. So while in a forest, trees actually start out in quite dense stands, they gradually thin themselves out to somewhere between 35 and 50 feet at mature size, with trees slowly dying very irregularly in the stand. And in urban environments, we really don't, I believe we don't have the desire nor ability to have random tree deaths over the life of the stand. We really want all the trees to grow roughly at about the same rate and grow for about the same length of time. So here we have live oaks that were planted. And I'm not sure how this little coppice of live oaks came about in this subdivision, but both of these trees are actually the same age, the live oak on tight spacing and the live oak on a single stem. And you can see that the canopies are about, the canopy of the single tree is about the same size as the canopy, the collective canopy of all of these 8 or 9 trees that are planted very close together. But you can also see that gradually over time, branches have fallen out of the tightly spaced tree, where the single stem tree has a much healthier, structurally a much better canopy, is easier to maintain, and a much more successful tree for the long term for the person who owns that particular tree. And we need to understand how the tree is going to perform at maturity. These are upright ginkgos planted on very, very tight spacing in Boston. And then on the right-hand side are century ginkgos, which are the most upright of the ginkgos, planted on about 20-foot centers. And you can see that they actually spread apart, have fairly wide spacing spread on their branches. They don't hold that very upright form, and are quite comfortable at 20 foot on center. I would expect the trees in the middle of these of the tightly spaced trees on the left, assuming that they grow, to be in tremendous conflict. Eventually, the outer trees squeezing off and killing off the center trees. And people plant trees on very, very tight spacing. These are some, I think, Leland cypress planted essentially root ball to root ball. And as we make the trees tighter, they become more and more susceptible to minor differences in the stand. So on the right-hand side, you can see that these tightly spaced trees, as they approach a large tree that was growing on the outside of this row, begin to thin down their trunk sizes, and one tree has died, and the stand is not regular, although the canopy appears to be very regular. A second thing that we almost always see in tightly spaced trees is the edge tree or the end tree is almost always larger than all the other trees, and that's because it gets more sun all the way around. When we take this idea into the city, we find essentially the same principles, so that the first tree in the line is often always bigger. There are reasons why it might not be, but that tree gets light on 3 sides, where the other trees in the row only get light on 2 sides. And then the building is also constricting the ability of the trees. And because the first tree gets really big, it becomes very powerful. So the second tree in the line is almost always the smallest in a line. So you have very large and very small as a result of the spacing being too tight for the species. Now, one of the reasons I hear that we plant trees on such tight spacing is, the way that they look, and we somehow have decided we can't wait for these trees to grow. This is a set of trees in Victoria, British Columbia, in which in different blocks they were planted at different times. So the top line you can see at 37.8 feet. It looks thin. You probably would guess that you wanted more trees. But when you look down that same street in perspective, you still see it reading as a tree-lined street. And there, in the perspective view, there appears to be enough trees. And then as those trees grow larger, by the time they get to be about 8 or 10 inches in caliper, at that 37-foot spacing, there seems to be enough trees in elevation, and the view still looks very good in perspective. And then down the street in another block, another set of trees growing at about 36.5 feet on center. And now we're just beginning to get canopies touching. All the trees are growing at the same rate, and the trees are healthy, and the perspective down the street looks good. So this is a healthy spacing, giving us trees that are going to be easy to manage and should grow at a consistent rate, and giving plenty of light in between the trees, and the ability to see signs and other things as the trees grow. One other advantage of wider spacing is that if you lose a tree, and we will lose trees in the city, there's now enough space to plant a replacement tree and let it become established in the hole between the two wider trees. And this is a very important feature if you're trying to manage a large stand of trees in a city. Now, when we start having grids or groupings or bosques of trees, a second dynamic begins to click in. So if I have a double row, my outer trees, the outer part of each tree grows to the left and to the right. And in the center, they're in conflict. And as the trees begin to grow heavier and heavier on each side, they begin to go into imbalance. And this can either cause branches to be pulled out, or trees to actually begin to lean over. By the time we get to 3 rows, the center row, as you can see, that center tree in that 3-row bosque gets almost no light anywhere. So it becomes a very, very small tree, where the perimeter trees become much larger. And in the picture at the bottom right, you can see that these trees all had the same branching height when they were planted, but even after just, I think this is about 6 or 7 years post-planting, we've already lost the bottom whorl of branches on some of these trees due to shading competition. So those center trees are going to become higher and higher, even though the stated design intent was to have a continuous, even canopy throughout the bosque. So when we add buildings, they will also reduce the sunlight. If you have a bosque which is directional to north, the trees on the north side of the bosque will grow slower than the trees on the south side of the bosque. So each of these light differences make each of these sets of trees grow at different rates. And when the canopies get smaller, the trunk diameters get smaller. So here is a 4-row bosque, the outside row growing at almost twice the trunk diameter rate as the inside, and some of the inside row trees beginning to decline, losing fairly large pieces of branch, and eventually this inside row will begin to die out. Here's Bryant Park in New York with London Plains planted at 25 feet on center. And it's a very, very large planting. And there have been some tree losses. And interestingly, all of the tree losses are in the interior rows of this bosque. I haven't lost any trees on the outer rows. I find Christian Science in Boston to be an interesting place to study because they're one of the oldest bosques of trees that I'm familiar with that is in confined rooting spaces. These are on top of a parking garage, but they have a large sheet of soil that connects all of these trees. I think it's over 1,000 cubic feet of soil per tree. And these trees are pleached. They're pruned almost every year to keep them in very, very tight, rounded forms. And they've been doing another trick on this interior row where on the outside row, they cut off all the branches on the inside so that the tree only has branches on the outside of the stand, while the center row is allowed to grow its branches in both directions so that the center row and the outside row are all growing at the same rate. Also, the trees were placed on diagonal alignments, and that also helps to make for a healthier stand. So I'm not sure that you can depend over time on the trees growing, somebody pruning the trees as carefully as these trees have been pruned, but certainly you can design your bosques to be diagonal in the alignments to improve the long-term health of the tree. Okay, Lita, I'm not able to advance here.
Are you? Do you have the PowerPoint window selected?
There we go.
There you go.
All right, I think I got it. So at Lincoln Center, Dan Kiley planted these bosques of trees, and in each one of these planters were 4 sycamores or plane trees. And they basically died out so that there was only 1 tree per bosque, and that dying out process was random throughout the stand, not exactly what was intended. So we tore apart those bosques on one side of Lincoln Center, but in the interest of historic preservation, we wanted to plant London plane. We wanted them to be on the same spacing, which I said was the reason, one of the reasons they died was because of the spacing. But came up with this idea of pleaching the trees on the interior, similar to the Palais Royal or to the idea that I showed you at Christian Science. And you can see the space in between the trees at the Palais Royal. But the problem is that we're not French. The Lincoln Center people were reluctant to start the pruning right away. They haven't done the aggressive pruning that is needed, and they're starting to lose the interior canopy on this particular set of trees. Olmsted, who we praise as being such a wonderful designer, understood all these principles. And he planted his trees on very wide spacing. So the mall in Washington, D.C., planted in 1936. Actually, this is an image from 36. I think it was planted earlier than that. Were planted on 50-foot centers. So there's plenty of room for these large elms to grow. By 1949, this image shows that the mall view that Olmsted wanted had already been set. The trees were large enough. Central Park, the walkway out to the Bethesda Fountain, he planted at 60 feet on center. And all those trees, or a good number of those trees, are still around. But at the Biltmore, they planted the trees in the main alley at 38 feet on center. And after about 85 years, they needed to be replaced as they were beginning to die off from competition. So when we don't replicate the Olmstedian spacing, Is there something that we know that Olmsted did not, or is there something that Olmsted knew that we are choosing to miss? On the right, you see the original battery in Charleston, South Carolina. Live oaks planted on 50-foot centers. When they extended the battery, the designer chose to plant the trees on 25-foot centers, which is way overly tight planting, and I'm sure that there will be significant problems with these trees as they begin to work out the competition problems. So when we're making our spacing decisions, we have to really ask ourselves a lot of questions. Solar access, the species tolerance to shade is critical. Are we trying to underplant? Is there a need for good quality turf? And things like soil volume, the space and direction of the canopy spread, what are our pruning management expectations, and what is our tolerance for loss of any one tree. So each of those questions we have to ask ourselves as designers, and not just assume that if we put trees on very, very tight spacing that they will simply be a successful stand. So I think that the right spacing for street trees, single rows of trees, is about 35 to 45 feet. It gives us a reasonable first impression and gives us good long-term growth on the trees. I planted a set of trees at the the Bureau of Printing and Engraving on 60-foot centers, which I thought really was going to look bad. It didn't look, I didn't think it looked bad at day one, and now I think they're just about right, 60 feet on center. It feels good when you're there in the scale of the space. So let's move on to the next item, which is the base of the tree, the trunk flare and zone of rapid taper roots. These are very large structures, very dynamic structures that must grow, and as we start to grow very, very large trees, these are the areas that become in conflict with paving and other things that we put close to the tree. So I've seen some really ridiculous ideas about how we can put things around trees, and I just don't know where we are at as designers to create images like this. And I can't believe that that even on a place as densely used as the High Line, that I needed that I needed swamp white oaks on about 9-foot centers, and also that I needed to get the paving right up to the edge of the trunk at planting. I don't know what the plan is to increase the openings as those trees grow. I don't know what the plan was when whoever put this plastic ring around the tree, how that was going to be dealt with as a management technique. But it clearly shows that the designers of these spaces didn't understand what was happening with long-term growth of trees. These are powerful, large structures that can totally modify the environment that they're in, and we have to respect them. We have to come up with schemes that acknowledge that these structures are going to happen, and what is the management plan for either adapting the paving or letting the tree adapt the space around it. I keep hearing that, well, we need lots of space to walk, and everywhere I go when I see these kinds of constrictions around trees, I'm never convinced that I need that much walking space. Somehow we were able to restrict the walking space for cafes, for seating, lighting, other things, but the tree always ends up getting these tiny little holes in the space. It just shows a total lack of respect for what the tree must do. There's a difference between square holes and round holes as we make these holes bigger. I think that the square holes are better in that they don't form these rings around the tree that are quite as bad as the round holes. The round holes create a set of roots that grow and form a noose around the base of the tree that is virtually impossible to deal with. Root guides planted around the holes should always be used, and that may help to some degree to reduce the circling. But clearly these holes all needed to have been bigger to acknowledge the space of the hole, the space around the tree. You can also see that this, in the lower right-hand side, the city made the hole a little bit bigger to take some pressure off of the roots around the tree, but it really didn't do any good to solve the problem of the ring of roots that had grown around the tree. I think the most offensive thing that landscape architects do are tree grates. I can find no moral or design or biological reason to put a tree grate around any tree. It just doesn't make sense to me. They always end up damaging the tree if nothing else is done, assuming the tree actually lives. The tree grate that you put paving on top of for me is even worse. It's much more difficult to inspect the soil under the tree. They're really hard to enlarge as the tree grows. The other thing the tree grate often does is it pushes the tree down in the space. For some reason, we feel like we have to have a lot of space between the bottom of the tree grate and the top of the root ball. And this puts the trunk of the tree, as it becomes in contact with the tree grate, at great risk because it's the most vulnerable part of the tree. So the size of the grate isn't really the problem. So making the tree grate bigger doesn't solve the problem. It's the size of the hole that comes out of the grate, or the construction of that hole. So this one where the pavers are coming up, this piece of plastic edging, which you can't see because of the pavers and the sand on top, are going to damage that trunk as those trees are growing into it. And when we come into contact with the tree, when the tree comes in contact with the grate above the trunk flare, which often happens because the tree root ball is pushed down into the space, as soon as that trunk becomes in contact with the grate, the tree begins to grow around it, creating a defect in the trunk, and if this keeps going, it will girdle the tree and then eventually kill the tree. These were the trees right down from the convention center in Denver. And I have no idea what the strategy is to enlarge these holes as the tree grows, because it's a very large welded structure that is holding up the brick. When you look in there, it just is an irrational design and I'm being very hard on the landscape architects here, and I apologize for being hard, but I can find no other words to say that this is irrational way of putting trees into the urban environment. So if we make the hole larger and we lift the root ball underneath the root the tree grate so that it's right underneath the tree grate, at least we give the tree a fighting chance to lift that grate out of the way before it begins to damage the tree. And all of these grates are only temporary. They have to come off very, very quickly. I'm not sure why we spend the money in the first place, but they definitely need to come out of there 10 to 15 years after the tree has been installed. The trees that were growing in silvacells now are growing at a very, very rapid rate. And so any constriction around the tree is going to be a problem very, very quickly. There's also the resin-bound gravel material, which originally the manufacturers said that the material should be held away from the trunk of the tree. I'm now seeing more and more the material put right up to the face of the tree. And I believe that we need to have a space around that tree to essentially let it mature, let it begin to develop the trunk flare. And once I have a trunk flare pushing up, I can push this material out of the way. But if I don't, if the root ball is too low, so that the trunk flare is not pushing up, once I come in contact with this material, I'm very likely to be damaging the tree. One idea that I've seen that I think works pretty well is this stabilized gravel or stone dust. There's a material a company called Stabilizer makes that can stabilize the gravel or stone dust and makes a material that the tree can easily modify and push out of the way and keep a relatively easy to maintain surface. Here was the 9/11 memorial. There were 3 different approaches. The majority of the trees are in these loose gravel openings. And while I would love to see the loose gravel openings be larger, that is probably a reasonable idea. I've used loose gravel before, and it seems to work pretty well. I think that putting plants around the base of the tree is for me, the best idea, because the plants can easily disappear as the tree grows and fills that space with wood. And then around the edge of the memorial are these metal grates, which totally perplex me. The cost of these, of building that little bubble in the middle, has got to have been incredibly expensive. I have no idea how one would modify this grate as the tree grows and begins to come in contact with the edge of that grate. Just not thinking about how trees grow when we come up with spending this much money on this kind of object. And we see all over the place incredible amounts of money, solid stone tops, which got to be expensive, beautifully designed, different ways of putting tree grates around. We're not lacking design, but we are lacking an understanding of the impact of what it is that we're doing. And I see sometimes, for example, in the lower left-hand corner, why did we add a tree grate there? We don't need it to make the walking space any bigger. And the tree would be so much happier without that metal object there. And who is going to come and lift that thing out of the way when it begins to be a problem? So just a waste of money for an object that we know is going to damage the tree. So ideally, if I ruled the world, I would have all the trees look like this. A very simple opening, as large as I can possibly make it, and the root ball right at the surface of the soil, a root guide put around the edge of the opening to force those roots to go down and then out. Of course, there'll always be something underneath that paving for them to go to, but that's a whole another issue. I think that the minimum size of this planting space should be about 6 feet by 8 feet. We're doing them 4 by 4 still. We've been talking about the inappropriateness of the 4 by 4 tree pit for 35 years now, and the optimum planting space is probably closer to 10 to 12 feet large in both directions. So here are some good examples of ways in which we might pave close to the tree or to protect the tree. We need to understand that these cobbles will be kicked out. Notice how in the lower left-hand corner that the tree is set fairly high, so that the roots are pushing on a slight bevel, and the cobbles can one by one be pushed out by the tree. I still think that planting under trees is an excellent temporary way of solving the problem, and eventually that whole space will be filled with wood, and it will look quite pleasant with the trunk flare filling that entire space. And then there is these lights that we put in these spaces. I am again perplexed. What is it that makes us think we can put this light box within inches of the trunk of the tree? What is the plan to change that whole system out once the tree actually grows? They often contribute to damage to the tree. There's so many things that lights, they just don't belong in trees. And we need to stand up and very proudly say this is not a sustainable thing, and we're just not going to do it. We do that for other systems. Why can't we do it for trees? One of the other problems of making the holes smaller is that we lose the ability to look at the soil. And especially early in the planting period, we need to be able to access the soil to check to see that the watering systems are correct. We might want to, in the long term, check and see what the nutrient levels in the soil are, see if there's a drainage problem. So I would like to see us start adding inspection ports at a point far enough away from the tree that we can get a set of data that's different than we get right at the tree. I'm having a terrible time getting anyone to install these. This set that you see here is at Metropolitan Museum of Art, where they did put in inspection ports. But even something as simple as this Wayne root feeder, which wasn't designed to be an inspection port, but could easily be adapted as an inspection port, either on top of the silvocell or right through Pervious paving or whatever paving system and root system you have. All right, so we're going to end on water into the soil. We're starting to spend a lot of money to put soil down there, and in looking through the Flickr page at the Deeproot site and looking at how the trees were actually doing, there was clearly the trees that had some way of getting water into the silvocells or into whatever the soil system is under the paving were clearly always doing better than the ones that didn't have some kind of watering system. I think that the best way to deal with that is a pervious paver system on top of the silvocells where the water can go directly down into the system. And pervious pavers come in all different effectiveness, so you need to pick one that will stay pervious for a long period of time. If we don't have a good soil system underneath the pavers, the roots will grow right underneath the pavers and start kicking up pavers, creating tripping hazards along the thing within the paving system if the tree is able to find some rooting system in which to grow. In Toronto, they're starting to put these trench drains along the backside of the curb as a way of collecting the water, and these are going to go directly or pipe directly into the silvocell system or whatever soil system that you've got under there. But some kind of trench drain is really important. I'm seeing people using these invisible trench drains, the little slot drains. I worry about them clogging and how difficult they are to maintain. And I think as you try to make things invisible, you generally introduce problems with the system. Clearly in this particular planting also, I would say that the planting hole itself needs to be much, much larger. If you're going to go for a distribution system where you're collecting the water in an inlet, like we did at, this is the Toronto Promenade, Sugar Beach, you need to make sure that the holes in that distribution pipe are facing up at the top, on the top or sides of the pipe, but not at the bottom, so we get a better distribution. You need to use glued joints. And don't put any filter cloth around the pipe, maybe a little filter cloth at the very top of the pipe, but you don't want to, the filter cloth, if it fills with sediment, will stop working. The amount of sediment and leaves that get into these systems is enormous, and we have to develop ways of collecting the sediment and the leaves so that it's easy to clean out, easy for maintenance people to access, and these forebays, areas where we're going to collect the sediment and the leaves, need to be quite large. I raked up about 200 gallons of leaves under my oak tree this fall. I intentionally measured them all to see what it was. So we're talking about an awful lot of material that can clog the system as we move along. But one of the problems of getting water into the soil is you're also, if you have salt in that water, you'll be introducing that salt. So in northern climates, either you've got to figure out a way of having the water only go in during the spring, summer, and fall, and or you need to flush these systems out with water right after the last snow melt, so that you don't have the collection of salt in the soil. I think we have a lot of work to do on salt to try to figure out exactly what the right thing to do with trees. I most often see salt as a problem in retail districts where shop owners come out and add additional salt to what the city is putting on. And also, I think species is a critical part of the equation that we also have to think about. So if we do all these things right and we get that part of the equation correctly, we can grow very, very impressive sets of trees very, very rapidly. So here at Sugar Beach, in just 4 growing seasons with trees spaced 30 feet apart in good holes with the root ball brought up to the surface, just a little light gravel on the surface, we've created the continuous tree canopy that we wanted in a very, very short amount of time, starting with fairly small trees. So please think about the future, think about what that tree is going to become, and design your systems so that that works well. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, and I'll turn it over to Lita and see what kind of questions we've gotten.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, we have a bunch of questions coming in, so we'll jump right in and make the most of our time. The first one is about planned thinning. What are your thoughts on planned thinning in urban tree stands? Yeah,
planned thinning is a great idea and concept. I've almost never seen it happen. The Freeway Park in Seattle is a good example where Lawrence Halpern it was very upfront that planned thinning was part of the scheme. By the time you got to the point where the trees were going to need thinning, they looked fabulous. And they were all growing very healthily, and people rose up in arms and said, no, don't touch these trees, and then eventually the whole stand began to collapse at one time, and they ended up having to take all the trees out and start over again. I just have not seen a successful planned thinning actually be successful. And the amount of time between when you first plant these trees and when they start looking really good is not that long. When I had a job at Skid Row and Merrill, and we went on one of my first projects there. We went to the dedication, and my mentor and boss, George Dickey, pulled me to the side. He said, "You see how the architects are taking photos of this building?" He said, "Don't take any pictures." He said, "Come back in 10 years and take your pictures. That's when you know you have a successful landscape." And I've really taken that to heart. I believe we must, if we are truly serious about environmental sustainability, we must plant our trees further apart.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, great. We'll move on to the next one. Thank you. Can you comment on creating formal arrangements in multiple layers, so different sized trees like parent and child stories, and what types of pairing work best for multi-generational plantings? Well,
the problem I see it is that about the largest tree we're going to be able to plant is might be 10 or 12-inch caliper trees. I don't think, I hope, I don't think we're talking about transplanting a 30-inch caliper tree. So then the smallest tree we might plant in that situation might be, say, a 1-inch caliper tree. I would be willing to bet that within 20 years you won't be able to see the difference between those two trees. They're too close in age. It's like when you go to a family reunion and the person who had their child right out of high school, by the time you get to the 50th wedding anniversary of the grandparents, you can't tell the difference between the children and the parents. They all look about the same age, and I think you'd find that to be true. So I think that's just an artificial construct. Have fun with it if you want, but I'd be surprised if you'd be successful.
Mm-hmm. In regards to tree spacing, would you revise anything that you said in today's presentation when planting trees in harsher urban settings where the lifespan of the tree is likely to be shorter?
Well, I don't agree that the lifespan in an urban setting needs to be shorter. And I think I prefaced this by saying that all these things that we used to do because the trees didn't grow. And if you're willing to accept that, that the trees aren't going to grow, all these other problems that I'm talking about aren't really big issues. The tree just simply doesn't grow. I'm not willing to accept that we have to say the trees won't grow. I want to grow at least a 50-year-old tree in the city, and my ultimate goal is that we should be able to get quite a few trees growing to be 100 years in the so-called harsh urban settings. We have the tools to do this. It's just the will to do it, to fight for the budgets, to fight for the things that we need to make these trees happen.
Mm-hmm. You spent a lot of time on tree grates in this presentation. What about tree grates that have breakable portions to accommodate tree trunk growth? Do those work?
Well, I've seen if they truly are easy to break out, they often break before you actually want them to break. But it still requires somebody go around and do something. The tree grates that I showed were actually fairly light tree grates, some of them. Some of them I showed would be almost impossible to enlarge. But the very first tree grate that I showed, which was at a National Park Service project in Washington, the tree grate was designed to be enlarged. It never was, and so even with all the money that the National Park Service has, and they have reasonably good budgets compared to other city agencies, they couldn't get to those trees, and they were girdled by the tree grate. I just don't see any reason to use them. They simply are a stupid idea. I can't put it any more bluntly than that. It's a stupid idea. They do nothing to protect the tree in any way. They do nothing positive for the tree. They're simply there for our design ego, and to make something that we think looks beautiful. And so often they either harm the tree, or when you remove them, the resulting space is so bad. Why can't we design something that looks good and is sustainable?
Along those same lines, Jim, what is your experience with trees in raised planters along a streetscape? Would that be a viable alternative?
A tree in a raised planter is good, but it needs to be a large raised planter. So a 4-foot by 4-foot raised planter doesn't do much for the tree and may introduce some problems. I would think you would need to be talking about a 6 or 8 or 10-foot square planter without a bottom in it. I assume you're talking about it not having a bottom. That may be a reasonable idea, but think about what the trunk flare and dynamics of the large tree that you're putting in there. And I should also say that we are talking about large trees here. If you're going to be talking about cherry trees or crepe myrtles, it's a totally different discussion. This is all about trying to grow large, mature trees in our cities.
In copse plantings where trees share space, you mentioned access to light as affecting growth. What about access to oxygen or water in those situations?
Well, there's plenty of oxygen. There's no issue there. And water, the tree is limited by water. If you had 1 tree in there or 10 trees, it's got the same water limitations. How much water can I get into the soil? And that's why we are finding that the trees that we get, we provide ways to conduct water into the soil do better than trees where we have sealed the tree off from water.
On the water topic, you showed a slide with distribution pipes in it. Can you speak at all to why there were holes only in the tops of those distribution pipes? Would that create a standing water issue?
Yeah, it's important that you fill the pipe as a manifold and then have the water leak out on a relatively even level pipe, so that I'm getting water going all over the soil system. That does leave a pipe that has some standing water in it. That does leave a pipe that has some standing water in it, and I think we should probably be drilling a couple of small holes in the bottom of the pipe to let that water leak out very slowly. But I'm talking maybe a couple of 1/4-inch diameter holes over the entire length of the pipe.
Mm-hmm. I think that was for Sugar Beach, the slide that we referred to in that previous comment. Could you speak a little bit more about the stormwater on that project and how it was directed into the area under the paving?
Right. Well, at Sugar Beach and the promenade, the first thing that we did was that all the silvacells were placed level, so that they're all in the same plane, which made it very easy then to lay the pipes out in a level plane. So the water comes into inlets, starts running down, the pipe runs, and there's 1 inlet for every tree, and then the water is circulating going up into the pipe riser and then out the holes. I don't remember exactly the detail on, but I do think that we had some drain holes in the bottom of the pipe to get rid of the excess water in the wintertime. I've been moving more to thinking about putting the hole in the side of the pipe as opposed to the top, which would, if the lower hole clogged, we could get and the pipe froze, it would not break the pipe because the pipe was only half full.
Okay, thanks, Jim. We have a question about green roofs, which I know are a topic of interest for a lot of people. Is there a recommended soil depth for trees used on green roofs, and have we seen successful urban tree growth on green roofs, proving that it can be sustainable?
Well, the trees at Christian Science, which are 45 years old now, are doing quite fine. They're in fairly deep soil. It's about 4 feet deep. The trees at Derry and Tom's department store in London, which were planted in the 1930s, are doing quite well. Trees on top of Rockefeller Center, which mostly were volunteers, growing in fairly thin soil sections. The only time I was up there looked like they were doing quite well. I think that the depth of the planting soil on a roof deck for a tree should be the depth of the root ball, plus a little bit, maybe 4 or 5 inches. Then that soil can get thinner away from the root ball, and it just becomes a soil volume calculation, so that the deeper I make the soil, the less area I need. If I have thinner soil sections, I simply just need to increase the area that the soil is spread over. But you're still restricted by that soil volume part of the equation when you're above structure.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned inspection ports. What should the maintenance plan be for the soil where there's an inspection port? Should the soil be tested annually or only when there's a problem?
I think I would primarily use them when there's a problem showing up, and the tree will telegraph problems pretty quickly. We had some problems at Lincoln Center when we first planted the trees, which turned out to be a drainage issue where one drain wasn't functioning. We were able to find that very, very easily by using the inspection ports that we had on that project. So we could also use those inspection ports as a way of adding liquid fertilizers to the soil. I just think that they're an important thing to have.
Great. Let's see. Can you comment on uniform street tree plantings that respond differently depending on their orientation? You talked a bit about how trees fare, whether they're on the north, south, east, or west side.
Right. Yeah. Trees. If you had a building that was absolutely orthogonal to north, equal conditions all the way around, I would expect the trees to grow differently on the north side and the south side and the east side and the west side due to subtle differences in the solar orientation. Differences are going to be amplified because the trees are going to introduce their own internal competition. And as the soil volumes are reduced, those differences will be amplified. So I would expect in a low soil volume environment, the trees on the north side of the building would grow better than the trees on the south side, and in a large soil volume environment, I would expect the trees on the south side to grow better than the trees on the north side.
Mm-hmm. In narrow sidewalk situations with buildings on one side, you showed a couple of examples of those. Should the building side of the trees be trimmed?
You shouldn't have to trim them. They will self-trim along the building, but if there is a building owner that is worried about the tree brushing against the building, you might have to do some pruning as a management scheme. But generally, the tree shade, buds brushing up against the siding is sufficient to keep that tree essentially pruned by itself in the right shape. It will never grow into the building.
Okay. We are bumping up against our time limit, so I'm just going to have a couple more questions. This one encompasses a lot of the ones that have been coming in. You obviously are no fan of tree grates, Jim, so what would you recommend as a strategy in planting zones with narrow pedestrian sidewalk areas, like 7 or 8 feet wide, for example?
So I've got an 8-foot wide sidewalk. The ADA would require that I have slightly under 4 feet of that sidewalk be for the to meet EADA. The rest of it I would make as an open soil, which could be, if I was really tight on space, I'd probably make it that stabilizer stone dust. Could be the gravel. Just sort of loose gravel idea. But that whole space is eventually going to be full of gnarly roots, so it's not the kind of planting space that I can count as a walking space.
Mm-hmm. So then for the last question, someone is asking, doesn't it make tree selection difficult if you have to account for the size of the planting space, for each species you're specifying? How does one manage that?
Well, I think that's part of our professional responsibility, and what we as landscape architects should be doing. If I was an engineer and I was designing a light pole and I had a 5-foot light pole or a 50-foot tall light pole, I'd have different footings on there, and the footings would be designed for that particular object. The rest of the construction industry seems to deal with that problem of different conditions all the time. I don't see why it's so difficult for a tree.
And lastly, I want to just get in one question about water. If I'm calculating how much rainwater I need to get into the soil just for good tree growth, what are the variables I should be looking at?
Well, I would start with the size of the drainage area, and the second. So I've got how much water. What is the total sphere of water that I can put into that tree, and is it too much? I would say in urban environments, it's rarely too much water because our drainage areas are so subdivided and controlled. I rarely see a place where I'm putting too much water in. The flip side of that should be, am I getting water out the bottom? So do I have a drainage system? If I have a reasonable way to get water out the bottom, I can put all the water I want in the top, and it will go through the system and drain out. So overwatering the tree is not a problem. So I don't have to do any calculations. I'm just making sure that I have an operable system.
Great. We're going to end there. We did have a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to. I apologize for that. If any of those question askers want to reach out to us on Twitter, our handle is @RethinkTrees. We'd be happy to try to answer those in conjunction with Jim that way. So please feel free to do that. A link to a recording of today's webinar will be sent out in a follow-up email tomorrow, and will also be posted on our YouTube channel. And you can find out more information on Deeproot on our website or on our blog. And Jim also has a website now, jamesurban.net. Check it out if you have not already. It has tons of great information and resources. And Jim, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Okay, thank you.